Hello and welcome to the How Not to Screw Up Your Kids Bucket Emptying episodes. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Han, psychologist, parenting expert. What do we mean by bucket emptying? So let me remind you, if you're already aware of the bucket resource, and if you're not, and this is the first time, then hopefully you'll find it a really, really helpful resource. So in essence, we all have a bucket. It's not a real bucket, it's a metaphorical bucket. And it fills throughout the day. We have a bucket and our children have a bucket. What usually happens is we don't notice that our bucket has been filled or is filling until that last drop of water goes into the bucket and the water overflows and we get explosion, big emotion, whatever that might be. Fear, anxiety, anger, frustration, annoyance, tears. So part of it is really being really mindful for ourselves as parents and adults, but also for our children so that they become mindful about what are the things that fill their bucket. Some of the typical things may well be too much to do, might be about lack of control, might be issues that they're having with work, schoolwork, it might be issues around friendships, it might be frustrations with a sibling, it might be around confidence, it might be lack of sleep, it might be hunger, it could be a whole host of different things. So that's one aspect to it because it helps us understand why we have in those moments our children just explode with that big emotion. And what usually happens is we find ourselves saying, what happened to Jack? I simply asked him whether he wanted peas and carrots, or I just asked him to put his shoes on, or I just asked him to go to bed, or just asked him to come off his device. And usually we get caught up in that moment of that last drop, and we forget that that bucket has been filling throughout the day. That was just the last thing that tipped things over. So the first thing when we're talking about buckets is being aware of what are the things that fill your children's bucket and also what are the things that typically fill your bucket. And there'll be some things that will follow a familiar pattern. We have them quite regularly that will fill our bucket. For me, one of the things that really fills my bucket is just not having enough sleep. If I've not had enough sleep, then potentially, depending on how little I've had, I might be waking up already with a bucket half full or 3/4 full. So it doesn't take very much before I tip into overwhelm. And so when we're talking about it in terms of the relevance to these podcast episodes, I'm talking about emptying your bucket. These episodes are around answering questions or giving you hacks and tips that are short and bite-sized that you can use and implement immediately that help you with something that you're dealing with right now. Either something that you're facing very personally as a challenge or something that you need support with specifically with your children. So that's the first part of the bucket. The second part of the bucket and being aware of our bucket is how we empty it. And this is quite an important thing. So you can get those glass jars, rather large jars that we can put cucumber in and lemon and all of these lovely things. And then it has a tap so that we can pour ourselves a glass. That's the same with our bucket. It has a tap. If we turn the tap one way, the bucket empties. If we turn the tap the other way, we think it's emptying, but it's not. And it's really crucial that we understand for ourselves. Remember, children are much more likely to do what they see than what we say. So it's really important that we understand the things that empty our bucket so we can model that to our children. So our children are then much better able to use the bucket analogy themselves and use it as a strategy and a support system so that they know what they need to do for themselves to empty their bucket. So it's really looking at what are the things that genuinely empty your bucket. And I'm very sorry to say, scrolling through your social media feeds mindlessly is not going to empty your bucket. Watching and downloading and streaming films is not going to empty your bucket. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not useful things to do. Of course they are. We get pleasure from those. But we have to understand that if we think we're emptying our bucket because we've spent an hour, 2 hours scrolling through our feed, what we will find is we've simply pressed pause. We've numbed that. We've quietened all of that stuff that's going on. But the level at which of our bucket is full remains the same. So being aware of the things, so it may well be for some people, it might be exercise, it might be fresh air, it might be having a conversation with a friend, it might be doing something creative, it might be cooking, it might be gardening, it might be going for a walk. Whatever it is, it's about knowing what empties your bucket, or reading. So I know that for me, some of the key things that are really important for me to empty a bucket is I have to get out in nature and be outdoors. Fresh air, fresh space that expanse of space is really, really crucial to emptying my bucket. And slightly embarrassed to say, but it is absolutely true, cup of coffee empties my bucket. I'm not a very pleasant person to be around if I haven't had my cup of coffee and I haven't been out in some fresh air. So it's being able to recognise I'm a big fan of journaling. I'm a big fan of doing yoga in the morning. These are the things that I'm aware that empty my bucket. Now, if I don't do any of those, for whatever reasons, because of circumstance for a day, it's not an issue. But if I don't do it for more than a day, I don't do them for 2 days in a row, it's a big issue. My ability to navigate things, my ability to show up as a parent and to show up in so many other aspects of what I do with life is massively affected by that. I'm much more likely to be snappy, short-tempered, make poor choices. So the whole purpose of these episodes is to be part of that bucket draining process by offering some bite-sized advice, some hacks, and answering your questions. But I'm a really big believer in the bucket resource, so we will also make the bucket resource available to you. As usual, you head over to my free resource library, www.drmaryhan.com/library, where all you need to do is pop in your email address and you'll get access not only to the bucket resource, but all the other free resources across all my other podcasts. As ever, if you have enjoyed this episode, and particularly for those of you that are joining us for the first time in our new bite-size slots and also on YouTube, then I would love it if you could review and rate and follow this podcast so that others can find us and we can spread the love. So until next time.